When people talk about religious sermons that focus on hellfire and eternal punishment, it's often framed as a moral warning. But beneath the surface, the real impact is psychological. It's not just about ideas of good and bad, or heaven and hell. It's about how fear rewires the mind, how it shapes identity, and how it can quietly follow someone long after they've walked out of a church. The concept of eternal punishment is unlike any other threat in human experience. It's infinite, inescapable, and timeless. No human authority can actually enforce it, but the suggestion alone carries extraordinary weight. If a parent says, "Behave or you'll be grounded," the mind knows there's a limit. But if a preacher says, "Obey or suffer forever," the scale changes entirely. The brain reacts to this as an ultimate threat. Psychologists have studied the effects of what's sometimes called religious trauma syndrome. Many former believers describe lingering nightmares, anxiety, or even panic attacks triggered by thoughts of damnation. These aren't just dramatic stories. They're real patterns found in research on people leaving fundamentalist or authoritarian faiths. Hell isn't just an idea. It becomes a mental environment that reshapes behavior and thought. One reason hellfire preaching has such a grip is that fear is one of the strongest motivators humans know. From an evolutionary standpoint, fear kept our ancestors alive. It made them avoid cliffs, predators, or poisonous food. But when fear is attached to invisible, unverifiable claims, the brain struggles. You can't run away from hell. You can't disprove it in the moment. So it stays lodged in the mind as a background noise, a constant what if that never fully quiets. Children are especially vulnerable. Developmental psychology shows that before a certain age, kids don't yet think in abstract categories. They take things literally. So when told that eternal fire awaits the disobedient, many children don't file that away as symbolic. They imagine it vividly, and the terror becomes part of their sense of reality. The bedtime prayer or the Sunday sermon isn't just guidance, it's a source of nightmares. As these children grow up, the images of torment can linger. Some adapt by repressing the fear, convincing themselves it's normal. Others live in cycles of guilt, constantly worrying if they've sinned, if they've prayed enough, if they're still safe from eternal punishment. This cycle mirrors obsessive-compulsive behavior, where the compulsion, in this case prayer or confession, momentarily relieves the anxiety, only for it to return stronger. Studies of authoritarian religious groups often show higher levels of anxiety, depression, and even post-traumatic symptoms among those who leave. And it makes sense. If you've been told for years that stepping out of line means unending torture, then leaving that belief system feels like leaping into a void. Even if you no longer believe, the emotional residue doesn't vanish overnight. Hellfire preaching also works by exploiting the asymmetry of fear versus hope. Hope can lift us, but fear is stickier. A hopeful message of heaven can inspire for a moment, but the threat of hell lingers longer and digs deeper. The human mind is wired to remember threats more strongly than promises, because threats are tied to survival. So the balance in these sermons isn't even, it's skewed toward fear, because fear is more effective at control. Another angle, often overlooked, is how hell reshapes morality itself. Instead of developing empathy-based ethics, where people do good because they understand others' suffering, hellfire preaching teaches obedience-based ethics. The question isn't what helps others, but what avoids punishment. Morality becomes externalized, rooted in fear of authority, not in compassion or reason. This can stunt the development of genuine moral reasoning because the ultimate concern is compliance, not empathy. This obedience-based model also makes people more vulnerable to manipulation. If you've been trained to obey religious authority because disobedience leads to eternal fire, it's not a huge leap to obey social or political authority presented as divinely approved. In history, this mechanism has been used repeatedly. Hell isn't just a theological idea, it's a political tool. It convinces people that questioning power is not just risky, but cosmically dangerous. Even when people leave these belief systems, the traces remain. Cognitive scientists talk about implicit memory, the kind of memory that affects feelings and behavior without conscious thought. Someone may stop believing in hell intellectually, but in moments of stress or guilt, they still feel flashes of fear, almost like a phantom limb. It's a leftover neural pathway carved by years of reinforcement. Some argue that fear-based preaching at least keeps people moral, but evidence suggests otherwise. Studies comparing secular and religious populations show that societies with less emphasis on eternal punishment often have lower crime rates, better social trust, and stronger community cooperation. Fear doesn't create genuine morality, it creates compliance when someone is watching. Take away the watcher, and the moral framework collapses. There's also the matter of self-worth. If you've been told since childhood that you are inherently broken, sinful, or deserving of punishment, that message takes root. People internalize the idea that they are bad by nature. Even the offer of salvation can't fully erase it, because the good news is always tied to the reminder of how bad you supposedly are. The cycle is like emotional debt. You're forgiven, but only after being reminded of your worthlessness. This damages mental health in ways that go beyond religion itself. People raised under Hellfire preaching often struggle with perfectionism, people-pleasing, or harsh self-criticism. These are coping strategies learned from trying to avoid punishment from an all-seeing authority. The result isn't peace or confidence, but a fragile identity built on fear of failure. One striking case comes from interviews with people who left high-control religious groups. Several described hearing sermons as children that painted graphic pictures of burning flesh, screams, and unending agony. Decades later, some still experienced intrusive thoughts of those images whenever they made mistakes in daily life. That's not spiritual guidance, it's psychological conditioning. What's often missed is that fear doesn't just control, it narrows imagination. If the mind is always occupied with avoiding hell, it has less space for curiosity, creativity, or free exploration. Fear turns the focus inward, onto self-surveillance and self-judgment. It's a mental cage, invisible but deeply restrictive. And the longer someone lives in that cage, the harder it becomes to even imagine life outside it. Hellfire preaching also undermines trust in natural emotions. For example, love or desire might be redefined as sinful. Curiosity might be treated as rebellion. Even doubt, the most natural response to uncertainty, is framed as dangerous. The message is clear: don't trust yourself, trust the authority, and once someone has been convinced not to trust their own mind, they become far easier to control. But perhaps the deepest damage comes from the way hell turns life itself into a test that can never be fully passed. No matter how much someone prays, believes, or obeys, there's always the lingering question: what if it's not enough? This uncertainty is part of the design. It ensures ongoing dependence on the system that claims to offer safety. The more someone doubts, the more they return to the authority, seeking reassurance, but reassurance never lasts. Breaking free from this conditioning takes time. Therapy, community support, and education can help, but the process is often long and painful. It involves not only rejecting an idea, but untangling years of fear woven into the nervous system. And yet, countless people do find freedom. They describe the relief of no longer waking in the night, terrified of eternal fire, the joy of rediscovering curiosity, and the strength of building morality rooted in empathy rather than fear. What stands out is that human beings do not need threats of eternal punishment to live meaningful, ethical lives. Compassion, cooperation, and a sense of shared humanity are enough. In fact, they're stronger motivators than fear, because they connect us to each other instead of isolating us in dread. When people step away from fear-based preaching, they often discover that morality, joy, and meaning were not tied to hell or heaven in the first place. They were always within the human capacity to care, to create, and to understand. There's another angle worth exploring: the relationship between fear-based preaching and authoritarian parenting styles. Research has shown that children raised in households where punishment is emphasized over explanation often grow up more anxious, less confident, and more prone to rigid thinking. When this dynamic is combined with sermons about eternal torture, the effect multiplies. The authority figure in the home and the authority figure in the pulpit both reinforce the same message: obedience is survival, questioning is danger. This double reinforcement doesn't just influence children's behavior in religious settings, it can shape their entire personality structure. People often describe feeling like they were living with two selves, one outwardly compliant, the other inwardly fearful and resentful. Over time, this split can create identity confusion, difficulty making independent decisions, and a lingering sense that freedom is unsafe. Interestingly, when psychologists study people who deconvert from fear-based religions, they often find that leaving is less like changing a belief and more like recovering from trauma. Symptoms can include intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, or even dissociation. It's not that the doctrine itself was a trauma, but that the unrelenting threat of eternal torture functioned as one. The body reacts to it the way it reacts to any prolonged threat, with heightened stress responses, chronic anxiety, and difficulty regulating emotions. Some defenders of Hellfire preaching claim that people exaggerate its effects, or that those who struggle are simply weak-willed. But neuroscience tells a different story. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, is activated not just by real physical threats, but also by vividly imagined ones. To the brain, the image of fire and torment can feel as real as an approaching predator. Over time, constant activation of this system reshapes the nervous system itself, leaving long-lasting imprints. It's also important to note how this kind of preaching fosters a cycle of dependence on the very system that caused the fear. The problem is created, fear of hell, and then the solution is offered: obedience to the church, constant prayer, unending devotion, but the solution never eliminates the problem. It only soothes it temporarily. Like an addictive loop, the relief of reassurance wears off, and the fear returns, driving the person back for more. This keeps individuals locked in the system, sometimes for life. There's another layer too: social belonging. Many communities are built around shared belief in heaven and hell. Leaving the fear behind often means leaving family, friends, and one's entire support network. That social cost reinforces the internal cost. Even if someone suspects the doctrine is false, the price of rejecting it feels unbearably high. The psychological grip isn't only in the fear of punishment after death, but in the fear of rejection and isolation in life. When people do find the strength to leave, it often comes with a mix of grief and relief. Grief for the time lost, the childhood innocence stolen, the relationships fractured, relief for the freedom from constant dread. Many describe a slow rewiring process where they retrain their minds to trust themselves, to see joy not as dangerous, and to value curiosity as something natural rather than sinful. It's not just a shift in ideas, it's rehabilitation from fear. One under-discussed consequence of Hellfire preaching is how it distorts the way people see others. If you believe most of humanity is destined for eternal torture, it's hard to truly value them. Compassion becomes conditional. Instead of respecting others for who they are, you see them as souls to be saved or as warnings of damnation. This dehumanizes relationships. Even love and friendship get filtered through the lens of fear and salvation. On the other hand, rejecting the doctrine often allows people to rediscover humanity in its fullness. Without the dividing line of saved versus damned, relationships become more authentic. People can care about others simply because they are human, not because they fit into a particular belief system. This shift, though subtle, can feel revolutionary for those who grew up seeing every interaction as a battle over eternal destiny. Hellfire preaching also leaves a mark on how people view death. Instead of being a natural part of life, death becomes a portal to either bliss or unimaginable torment. For many, this turns the thought of mortality into a constant source of dread. Rather than accepting life's finite nature and finding meaning within it, they live in fear of the unknown after. Breaking free from this narrative often brings not despair, but a strange kind of peace. Accepting mortality can make life feel more urgent, more precious, more worth living fully. Another overlooked aspect is how fear affects intellectual honesty. When people are taught that doubting or questioning could lead to eternal punishment, their capacity for honest inquiry is crippled. Even if evidence or reason suggests a belief might be false, the cost of admitting it feels too high. This leads to compartmentalization, publicly affirming the doctrine, privately suppressing doubts. Over time, this suppression takes a toll, creating inner conflict, cognitive dissonance, and emotional exhaustion. And yet, despite all this, many who escape hellfire preaching discover a kind of renewal. Freed from the need to constantly police their thoughts and fears, they begin to explore ideas, relationships, and experiences that once felt forbidden. They often describe the world as larger, brighter, and more interesting. What was once narrowed down to a binary of heaven or hell expands into endless possibilities of meaning, connection, and growth. One of the most profound outcomes is the shift from fear-based morality to empathy-based morality. Instead of asking what avoids punishment, people begin asking what helps others. This transition often leads to deeper, more authentic ethical choices. Without fear hanging over every decision, morality becomes an expression of care, not compliance. And this kind of morality is not only healthier, but also more sustainable, because it's rooted in genuine human connection. It's worth emphasizing that hellfire preaching doesn't just affect those who fully believe it. Even those who grow skeptical often carry its residue. The sudden rush of fear in the middle of the night, the hesitation to speak certain thoughts aloud, the unease when breaking a rule that once seemed sacred. These echoes can linger for years, but the fact that people recover shows the resilience of the human mind. Healing may be long, but it is possible. And what do people find on the other side? Many report an unexpected sense of wonder, not in supernatural promises, but in the natural world itself. The freedom to explore, to learn, to create without fear of eternal consequences. That shift, from fear to curiosity, from guilt to self-acceptance, is perhaps the most radical transformation of all. In the end, the psychological impact of hellfire preaching is not just about what people are told in sermons. It's about how those words shape identity, morality, relationships, and mental health. The damage is real, and the fear is powerful, but it is not unbreakable. Again and again, people show that they can unlearn fear, reclaim trust in themselves, and build meaning not from threats of eternal fire, but from the simple, profound reality of human life. The way hellfire preaching shapes entire cultures, not just individuals. When communities organize around a shared belief in eternal punishment, social norms change. Doubt becomes taboo, conformity becomes virtue, and those who question are branded as dangerous. In such an environment, creativity, dissent, and critical thinking are not just discouraged, but actively suppressed. The culture itself becomes risk-averse, hesitant, and self-censoring. This cultural dynamic is visible in education. In places where fear of hell dominates, certain subjects are treated with suspicion. Science that challenges literalist interpretations, literature that explores alternative moral frameworks, or philosophy that raises fundamental questions. All of these can be dismissed or demonized as threats to salvation. The result is a narrowing of intellectual horizons, a form of collective self-limitation. And yet, history shows that when societies loosen the grip of hellfire preaching, they often experience bursts of creativity and progress. Freed from the constant threat of eternal consequences, people feel safer to experiment, to innovate, to test new ideas. It's no accident that periods of social flourishing often follow declines in fear-based religious control. The lifting of fear opens space for curiosity and growth. There's also the matter of politics. Leaders throughout history have used the threat of hell to secure loyalty, discourage rebellion, and justify authority. When eternal punishment hangs in the balance, earthly power is harder to challenge. This intertwining of theology and politics shows how effective fear can be as a tool of control. Even today, echoes of this dynamic remain in debates about laws, rights, and social policies that are defended with threats of eternal consequences. The irony is that hellfire preaching, while claiming to provide certainty, actually thrives on uncertainty. No one can ever know for sure if they are safe. That ambiguity is the engine that keeps people returning, obeying, and fearing. A system built on fear can never afford to give real peace, because peace would dissolve its power. So the fear is sustained, renewed, and passed down from generation to generation. Breaking the cycle often requires extraordinary courage. It means confronting not only the terror of eternal punishment, but also the grief of leaving behind a community that may not understand. It means walking away from the safety of ready-made answers into the uncertainty of self-discovery. And yet, those who take this step often find that uncertainty itself is liberating. Because uncertainty is simply honesty, it is the human condition, not a flaw to be feared. The psychological scars of hellfire preaching are real, but so is the possibility of healing. People who once lived under constant dread often describe the slow relief of realizing that the nightmare loses power the less it is fed. Therapy helps, but so does community with others who have walked the same path. Telling stories, naming fears, and reclaiming language are all part of dismantling the invisible cage. For many, the ultimate transformation is not just escaping fear, but learning to trust themselves again, to recognize that their thoughts are not dangerous, their curiosity is not rebellion, and their humanity is not broken. The shift is profound, from seeing oneself as a sinner awaiting judgment to seeing oneself as a human being capable of growth, kindness, and meaning. That reframe is more than intellectual. It's emotional, physical, and deeply personal. What stands out in all these stories is the resilience of the human mind. Fear may leave deep marks, but it does not erase the capacity for joy, for love, for wonder. People who grew up with terrifying images of fire and torment often find that once those images lose their grip, life opens in unexpected ways. They discover beauty not in spite of mortality, but because of it. They build morality not on threats, but on empathy. They find meaning not in promises of eternity, but in the reality of now. The psychological impact of hellfire preaching, then, is not just about sermons or doctrines. It is about how fear reshapes lives, communities, and cultures. And yet, the story doesn't end there, because fear, however powerful, is not the final word. The final word belongs to those who choose to live fully, to think freely, and to embrace the fragile but real gift of being human.